You're a farmer in southern France in the 800s. Your farm was just hit by a hailstorm and your crops are heavily damaged. You're now not sure you have enough food to survive the coming winter. And the other peasant farmers are whispering that this wasn't just blind bad luck. No, your village was targeted, and worse than that, it was sold out by one of your own. Who would do this? And why are you so afraid of raiders from above the clouds? Today we're talking about the high-flung, cloud-bound land of Magonia from medieval European myth and folklore. But first, hello! My name is Garvin and I read things and natter on about them on the internet for your entertainment. With the introductions out of the way, let's turn to the land of Magonia. Now, unlike other lost lands I've covered, Magonia is preserved by a single written source, which might make it the most obscure lost land so far. The treatise is entitled On Hail and Thunder, and it's written by Archbishop Agobard of Lyons. In this treatise, he complains about the peasants of his bishopric clinging to non-Christian beliefs. In this specific case, he's talking about their belief in a region called Magonia that sends ships that fly through the clouds using hail and storms to attack villages and farms in order to carry off food for themselves. And what's really interesting is that these storm raiders have local allies. They're magic workers called the Tempestarii. This is an interesting group of folks here, but before I get too deep into them, let's talk about the Archbishop here. Agobard was a Spanish-born priest who fled the Moorish invasion of Spain when he was 13. He settled in French Lyon and devoted himself to religion, becoming a full priest at the age of 35. He would make bishop by the age of 47. Agobard was also something of a skeptic and pushed the idea of using reason with faith, opposing practices he considered to be bad theology. For example, he was against trial by ordeal, which is where they would take someone who had been accused of a crime and make them do something painful and dangerous under the belief that God would work a miracle to protect anyone who is truly innocent. A good example of this is they would make you walk 9 feet, or 2.7 meters for my non-American friends out there, while holding a red-hot iron. Or they would make you reach into a cauldron to pull something out, only that cauldron would be full of boiling oil. And this is not a good way to determine innocence. It is also incredibly bad theology. It's just outright torture. And I can't believe no one was paying attention when Jesus Christ himself said, "Do not tempt the Lord thy God." Let me get back on topic, though. Like me, Agobard thought trial by ordeal was a bad idea. He was also against relic worship, which is something Christians shouldn't do, and against what he called excessive veneration of the saints. I'm not going to dive into that rabbit hole. He also thought the idea of people having magic powers was just completely stupid, which will be important later, so stick a pin in that. In short, Agobard really seemed to just believe in one thing, and that was the death and resurrection of Christ, and he would be damned before he let anyone clutter up his faith with stuff he considered half-pagan rituals and superstitions. It's not all sunshine and roses with this guy, though. Agobard was, well, to be blunt, he was kind of a howling bigot who hated the fact that he had to share a continent with Jews. At the time, the Jewish community was protected by Louis the Pious, the son of Charlemagne, which would be enough to make most priests back down. Agobard did not back down. He doubled down and would go so far as to write public proclamations saying that the Jews were all children of the devil. Now, that said, he did leave the Jews out. If they would convert to Christianity, he said they would be cleansed of their evil and become good and fine people. And I'm not sure, you tell me, does that make that better or worse? Either way, his positions and his writings on relationships between Christians and Jews were fuel to a growing strain of anti-Semitism, and that would haunt Europe for millennia. But let's get back to the topic of this video. Let's talk about the Tempestarii. The Tempestarii were basically people who were believed to be or claiming to be magic workers who could control the weather. Specifically, they were believed to be able to raise or prevent storms. Some people openly claimed this and took payments from their neighbors to prevent storms, which I guess that could be kind of a sweet gig, do nothing, get paid. But it could also be dangerous because if a storm did happen and people lost their crops, the very crops they were depending on to feed themselves and their families, those neighbors had a tendency to start hunting down Tempestarii and violently murdering them. Apparently the most common method of murder was through stoning, which is not a fun way to go. Agobard thought this belief was completely stupid and ridiculous because, in his words, even ignorant peasants should know that only the Almighty can control the weather, and he would not grant that power to anyone but righteous people, and the devil most certainly could not grant such powers. Agobard seemed to be making an argument that witches, at least in the context of devil-worshipping people with magic powers, could not exist because the devil could not grant such powers, only the Almighty himself could. All of this rather dramatically came to a head when his local congregation dragged 4 captives, 3 men and a woman, to the church and accused them of falling out of skyships. Now, that meant that they were accusing these people of either being witches or being in league with witches, and perhaps, more excitingly, plotting to destroy their crops so that they would starve over the winter. So, as you can imagine, a lot of people were reaching for rocks. Agobard didn't believe a word of this, though, and he waded into the crowd himself and dragged the truth to light, and in the process, freed the 4 captives and kept anyone from being bludgeoned to death by heavy rocks that day. So that's one good deed we can be absolutely sure rest in his name. Getting back to the Tempestarii, however, versions of them would reappear throughout European folklore, outliving the arguments against them, and would also reappear in later fiction. In fact, the Romanian version, the Solomonari, are referenced in Bram Stoker's Dracula, especially the school that trains them, the Scholomance. Magonia's link to magic and wizardry doesn't just end there, however. In the book Etruscan Roman Remains in Popular Tradition, published in 1892 by Charles G. Leland, an American folklorist, it talks about Magonia. Now, the book is mostly focused on Italian folk beliefs and folklores, using that to try and reassemble information about Etruscan religion and practices. But, for our purposes, it records a tradition from around Florence that states that Magonia was built by wizards and witches who were unable to enter heaven, but they disdained living on Earth with the rest of us dirt farmers. So they built a city in the clouds. And they did not share. However, earthbound wizards could come and visit, so that kind of suggests some sort of student-teacher relationship to me. I should mention, that's not in the text, that's me inferring it. That said, if you're working on some sort of magical school story, don't be a Harry Potter clone, don't have a boring medieval castle. Set your wizard school in the literal clouds, come on! Okay, back to Magonia. Now, it's interesting to note that Magonia seems to be part of a wider tradition that stretched into Germany as well as France and Italy. The same book references a story from Upper Franconia where there were storms so violent that the locals were afraid the hail would destroy their whole town. And a group of local Franciscan brothers were meeting in their garden to try and figure something out while gazing warily at an approaching thunderstorm, when, lo and behold, a beautiful, stark naked woman dropped right out of the sky into their garden. It turned out this lady was the local miller's wife. I should mention, by the way, in most medieval stories I've read, the miller is never a popular guy. Now, the monks responded by throwing clothes on this poor lady and hustling her into the monastery. And they not only saved her from sin, but, execution. Now, I'm going to be honest, I'm from Tornado Alley, and my knee-jerk reaction if someone dropped stark naked from the sky wouldn't be witch, but man, the tornadoes are that bad this year. But this isn't the only wider tradition that Magonia is part of, though. In various parts of Western Europe, with most recorded stories seeming to come from the British Isles, there's a tradition of people sighting skyships. with stories of the sailors of these ships being able to swim through the air as if it was water, and if some rude fellow from the ground gets a hold of one of these guys and keeps them from going back up, the tradition is that they will start acting like they're drowning. And in some cases, they will even cry out that our air is too heavy for them to breathe. The most complete and famous story I could find was the airship of Clonmacnoise, an Irish story where airships flew over a celebration, and one of the sailors on the ship threw a spear that missed its target, so he dove off the boat and swam down to retrieve it, only for the Irishman there to grab him, apparently to interrogate him as to how he could fly, and he started screaming that he was going to drown. There are various versions of the story, but in most of them, an authority figure, usually a local king, orders them to let the man go, and he shoots up to his boat and sails off into the sunset. There's also an English story that involves a skyship dropping anchor, and that anchor getting stuck in a church arch during Mass. And that story goes much the same as the Irish one, only with an abbot telling people to let the sailor go. So, it appears from these stories that there's at least something of a widespread belief of people living amongst the clouds, which kind of makes me look at Jack and the Beanstalk just a bit different. Magonia would also appear in more modern beliefs and traditions. For example, in 1969, Dr. Jacques Vallée, a French-born computer scientist, venture capitalist, and UFOologist, wrote a book called Passport to Magonia, From Folklore to Flying Saucers. In that book, he tries to draw a link between UFOs and these medieval skyships, as well as between stories of alien abductions and fairy abductions that happened in medieval stories. And there were people in the UFO community who were offended by the very idea and fought against it. There are also people who found the ideas insightful and embraced them, and they could be represented in the long-running British UFO magazine Magonia Archive. Magonia also appears in modern fiction. For example, there's the novel entitled Magonia by Maria Headley, about a young lady who discovers that there's a world in the clouds above her and that she has a connection to it. And the story is also about all the trouble that connection brings her. The idea of people living high above us in the sky, whether it's in floating cities or castles, or even just sky islands, or even if they're living directly on the clouds, is something that reappears again and again. Even in D&D, you have cloud giants and other monsters who can build entire kingdoms on clouds. There's just something about the sky that makes us want to reach up and hope that someone will reach back down to us, I guess. It's on that admittedly speculative note that I'm going to end this week's video. I hope you found it informative, or at least entertaining. If you did, please leave a like, a comment, or consider subscribing, as all of that helps me in my eternal battle with the Dread Lord Algorithm. Terror be on his name. If you'd like a voice on future videos, consider joining my Everwise patrons. They are voting on future content. Speaking of patrons, I'd also like to thank my biggest supporter, Big Steve. I hope you keep aiming high, dude. Next week, we're looking at another island. We're looking at the British legend of Lyoness. I hope you'll join me, but until then, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and keep reading.